Welcome back, everybody, to Constructive Uncoupling, the podcast devoted to amicable divorces. I'm Judy Weigel, your host and amicable divorce expert. Why? Because that's all I do, amicable divorces. Today I wanted to take time to talk about responsibility. Taking responsibility for whatever we're supposed to take responsibility for in the marriage. Well, this is a podcast about divorce, and there's a whole lot of responsibility to accept when you're getting divorced, either to clear up the past or to go forward. But just taking responsibility in general in life is so unbelievably difficult. First of all, it takes time just to process whatever the issue is that comes up in our lives. We can't really see what our level of responsibility is or was in certain situations that may be complex, that may be highly emotional, that may have many layers to it, that may have many players to it. And we really have to mull over this issue, whatever the issue is in our lives at any time, so that we can really come to grips with what really happened, without making excuses for ourselves, without trying to avoid responsibility and indebtedness to somebody else. We sometimes just gloss over, we go into protective mode. When something happens, when something negative happens, when something challenging happens, well, the first thing we do is go into protective mode. Who doesn't? It's, fight or flight. Once we go into protective mode and kind of give ourselves a safe space, now it's time to really think about what happened. Truly assess as honestly as you can, without any voices around you, what happened, why are you in this situation, and how can you best move this situation forward for its most positive end. I mean, that's kind of the process in life when anything happens to us that's of a negative nature. But now let's focus on divorce, the hardest situation of all. Highly emotional and very financial, all at the same time. That is unbelievably difficult to deal with. Just processing our emotions alone takes time. But now you have obligations of finance on top of emotion. Time. Everybody needs time to get through this. So I want to start out my process of dealing with taking responsibility by just giving you 3 short stories, and then we'll go through the bullet points. So the first story is one that is truly heartbreaking. You have a young couple, high earner, one spouse is a high earner, and I've seen that typically with men. Once in a while it happens with women, but typically with men, very high earner young man. And you have a lovely wife who does work, but nothing close to what the husband makes. And if it's male, female, gender, just flip it around. Now, the lower wage earner just simply falls out of love with the higher wage earner. And what happens is, I have never seen it fail, the lower wage earner wants all the rights and laws that she's entitled to. That is one of the toughest situations of all. I have never seen a young wife say, I am so very sorry. I know we built this marriage on hopes and dreams. I know you had plans for a family, and I know you're in love with me. And I'm so sorry. I'm just not in love with you. And by the way, this breakup happens merely a few years into the marriage. Not 10 years, just a handful of years in the marriage. I have never seen the young wife say to the husband, I don't want anything from you. It is me who's backing out of the marriage. I'm so very sorry. I know I'm breaking your heart. I have never heard that said yet. And the young the lower wage earner, yes, is right. There's laws of entitlement. There really are. There's laws that say how to divide community property in California, laws that talk about spousal support, marital standard of living. It's all there. Nobody's doing anything illegal by asking for those rights. I'm talking about human. This is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in the human world now. Because you can get out of the marriage by asking for whatever you are allowed to ask for by law. But what does that say for you going forward as a human being? How have you shown the person that you simply fell out of love with that you actually care that you've hurt this person? So this is very philosophical. It gets away from the law and rights. But I'm just saying this because in the world of human feelings, to take responsibility for being the one who has backed out of the marriage and possibly surprised the other spouse, the higher wage earner, maybe just for karma purposes, you might want to just take some level of responsibility and not take every single thing you can get. That would speak boatloads about taking responsibility for the emotional devastation created by simply falling out of love. And by the way, you're not a criminal for falling out of love, and I don't mean to say that. I'm just talking about taking human responsibility for affecting somebody else's life. That's all I'm saying. It's a conversation I cannot ever have in the office, and I would never have it. I really go strictly according to law. But in this podcast, it's my opportunity to reach out to anybody in this situation. If you're the one backing out of the marriage and you're the one asking for a division of assets and assets that are coming from your other spouse, that you may have nothing to contribute, I'm just suggesting for karma and for taking responsibility for the one backing out of the marriage if nothing untoward has happened. Now, this is given, of course, that the other spouse, the high-earning spouse, has done nothing more than get up, love you, go to work, and try and support you. If there's other things going on, of course, then that's a different discussion. But in some of the situations that I've seen in marriages that have ended in a few years, it doesn't seem like anything else has happened. All right, now I want to give you a second story. This is about one spouse is addicted to substance, whether it's alcohol, drugs, pornography, gambling, it really doesn't matter. Addiction is addiction is addiction. So you have two people. Maybe one person either hid the addiction, period, and didn't let the new wife know about it, or had the addiction under control, acknowledged that it was there, but led the wife to believe, and maybe reasonably so, that the addiction was under control. Well, addiction is a daily experience. Having something under control is minute by minute, and my heart goes out to anybody with addiction issues. It's just so difficult to live because it represents so many things, so many emotional layers going on in somebody's life. But this happens when you have one spouse who's addicted, the other spouse who isn't, and you have children involved. If there's no children involved, this story doesn't mean anything. But when there are children involved, it really affects the co-parenting schedule. And the person who has substance abuse issues cannot be alone with the children. It's just not possible. If that happens, if the other spouse, the non-addicted spouse, lets that happen, both people are guilty of endangering the child. And quite frequently, the child can be taken away from both parents till both parents understand the reality of their situation. But this is a very common story where the addicted parent is in denial that they're in addiction. They won't talk when they come to the office that last weekend they just used substance again. They won't say that. What they will say is, I feel like the world is against me. I feel like I'm being persecuted and punished for my past behavior. And they won't acknowledge that there's no such thing as past behavior. Everything is in present time. Past behavior becomes present behavior. The decision not to use drugs or gamble or engage in pornography, that is a minute-by-minute decision. And unless there is an expanse of time, generally a year or more, where that person is completely under control, as much as they can be, then there is a responsibility to the other parent about the children and not putting the children alone with you. And so, we have a story of a wonderful, wonderful, lovely spouse who could not admit in the mediations or while we were filing that there was a substance abuse issue. Just simply couldn't admit it. It was still too raw, and this had been years it had been going on. Still too raw to even address it, but just fell victim to, or played the victim role in the arrangement of co-parenting time with the kids, but not alone. That was so difficult to embrace that had to be the standard until a much larger time of being away from the substance could be declared, could be proven, could be supported. And it's so very hard for somebody on addiction who is addicted. It's so very hard for that person to say, yes, I have an addiction. It is a daily issue. I am proud that at times I have been able to handle it and not use it on a daily basis, but I haven't gotten my emotions under control enough and my issues under control that have supported the addiction. I'm not hearing that. I'm just hearing, poor me, the world is against me. I can't believe this is happening. How fair is this? I can't be with my children ever. And that's not the case. It's never, ever. It's always until you've got a handle on this addiction for a long enough period of time that you can be reasonably assured that the children will be safe. That's really where it's at, that the children will be safe. And so that's seriously taking responsibility for your actions. And it certainly doesn't mean you're a bad person. Never, ever, ever does this mean that. It means that you're a person in need. And we are all in need in various areas of our lives. We really do need help. We all have something that is hard for us to control. But if you are the person who's addicted, just admit it. Just say it, because everybody knows it. Everybody can see it. You're not hiding anything. It's like a really fat woman who's wearing a muumuu, thinking she will cover up the folds. No, if you're fat, you're fat. And I'm telling you, I used to be fat. So I know clothing does not make you look thin. Clothing makes you look better, but it doesn't make you look thin. If you're overweight, you're overweight. That's the way it is. If you have an addiction issue, you have an addiction issue. There's nothing you can do about it except address it. You can't hide it. It's not going to go away. But when you admit something like that, which is so heavy, people really do feel for you. Most people, well, hopefully most people are not judgmental, at least the people in your life. I would expect, if you have a substance abuse issue, the people in your life are so supportive of you and really want you to get better and don't think ill of you. Just admit you have the substance abuse issue, explain that it's extremely hard to get control of it on a daily basis, and you're doing the best you can. And I am telling you, the respect for you will be beyond belief. And when you can get it under control, everybody will come back in your life who is your true friend. And I want to end then with a third example. So a lot of times people have children when they had no intention of having children. And now what do? Do you have an abortion? Do you get married and have the child? This is a really, or do you have the child and not get married? So 3 different situations. You either don't have the child, you do have the child and stay single and co-parent, or you have the child and get married. So this is a story about 2 absolutely wonderful, lovely people who had no intentions of having a child, yet they did. They were just dating, and they honestly tried to do what they thought was the right thing, and they got married. Well, it didn't work out. The marriage wasn't to be, but they both loved their daughter unbelievably, and they both wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. Nobody wanted to scrimp on child support or obligations for their daughter. Yet it was such a struggle dealing with the co-parenting plan, dealing with how child support was going to be handled and spousal support for the wife and how this all worked out with making more money. And there was a certain point in the mediation I just said, you know what? You are such wonderful, lovely people, and you really tried to do the right thing by getting married and giving your daughter the environment of a family unit. And it just didn't work out. I think you should congratulate yourselves. I really did. I really thought that they should just take a moment and say, wait a minute, what are we arguing about? We really tried to do something that we never planned on doing, which is get married. How responsible is that? That's hugely responsible. And it's okay it didn't work out. But what did work out is that we have this fabulous, fabulous daughter. And we both love her so much, and we both want to take care of her. That doesn't happen in a long-term marriage sometimes. You don't have both people that are so committed to their children that they want to spend as much time with their children as they both can possibly share. And I think that kind of turned their situation around a little bit. But I'm just sharing that for people in this position where you may have gotten married because you felt it was the right thing to do, to give your child the framework of a formalized union, but it just wasn't meant to be. Give yourself a lot of praise and a lot of credit for trying. And then use that to really grow in respect for one another. Because that's where it should be. You did the best thing you could by providing the environment that you thought was going to be right for your child. And nobody can fault you for that. So, with those 3 stories in mind, accepting responsibility and doing the best you can going forward, let me go through my notes for you. So, the first thing is, if you should take responsibility and you don't, this is what might happen. You'll have to hire attorneys, even if there's nothing to divide, in a completely simple divorce. And why would you want to do that? Number 2, you won't grow from the experience. If you don't admit responsibility, you'll never grow from this experience called divorce. And divorce is one of the hardest things anybody ever goes through, as simple as it is. I say this every time to my clients. I had a very, very straightforward, simple divorce. No children, nothing to divide. We both had jobs. We made about the same amount of money. Nobody hated one another. And it was still the saddest year of my life. It was such a life-changing experience. And I hopefully used it for the better. I hopefully did. But if you don't use the experience of divorce to grow and take responsibility for your part, that was tough for me, by the way. I really had to look at my level of responsibility. Not with, and no blame on my ex-husband. That would have been ridiculous. There is no blame. All you can do is deal with yourself. Everybody has to deal with themselves in a divorce. and I want it to grow. 3, you'll make your children miserable. I mean, literally, even if you don't intend to, your energy and your lack of taking responsibility for your own actions in the divorce will literally throw your children into a terrible experience as a result of a divorce. And you don't want to do that. So just please take stock in yourself. Don't blame the other person. Whatever responsibility you have to admit to and share, do it. And then have a good time co-parenting your children and raising your child. Because they can be fun, can't they? And number 4, you'll ruin your opportunity to grow. Well, I already said you won't grow from the experience. You won't. But to discard that opportunity to grow, that's a shame, because you're wasting a valuable asset, and the asset is learning. So taking responsibility allows you to learn and grow so that when you have your next relationship, you can do much better. Next section, how to assess responsibility. Well, you have to be honest about your behavior as a spouse. We always have choices in our behavior. Did our behavior in any way contribute to the downfall of the marriage? You really have to look at that. Maybe you were doing things you didn't even think were being negatively impactful on your spouse. Because you know what happens? We take with us the relationships that we had with our parents. Unless we've done a lot of therapy on ourselves, we don't even realize we repeat the behavior of our parents. And whatever our experience was as a child with our parents, guaranteed we will give that back to our children, and we will give that back to our spouse. So be mindful about the choices you have in behavior. And if your spouse is saying that your behavior is hurting them, figure out why and go back to the root and see if it's something that stems from your upbringing. Number 2, did you have the best intentions by entering the marriage? You know, a lot of times people get married because they are lonely and they don't really assess who they're getting married to. Now, you know, in a cultural melting pot, a lot of people get married for immigration issues. Some people get married because the other person represents financial security to them. Not that you want to take advantage of that person, but they represent financial security, and maybe you never had financial security growing up. And that seemed like a valid reason to get married, and it doesn't stick. Number 3, well, why did you marry? Why did you marry this particular person? You really have to sit down and look at why. There may have been a reason that you didn't even see as an obvious reason. Maybe you talked yourself into loving this person. Maybe that's what you normally do, is talk yourself into loving people. But you have to really look at why. Only you know why you chose to marry, and you chose to marry this person. Now, I say first why you chose to marry because not everybody's suited for marriage. I don't think I am. Although I love when people are married for a million years. I think that's so heartwarming. And in my previous incarnation as a person producing entertainment for private events, I did 1 million weddings. I loved standing at the marriage ceremonies. Those were such sacred events to me. I always got teary-eyed. But yet, I don't think marriage is for me. And I think there's a lot of people out there. Marriage doesn't mean relationships aren't for you. It just means marriages aren't for you. In fact, it is so surprising to me that I will do divorces for people who lived together for years. They either had or did not have children, and then all of a sudden one day they say, well, why don't we just get married? And it's getting married, it's that formal union that didn't feel right. Some people need to live in a less formally structured relationship in order to be happy. They need that huge freedom that a lack of a marriage license provides. Maybe you're that person, but it's really important to know, why did you marry And why did you marry this particular person? Number 4, what were your expectations for the marriage? So we all have different expectations of the marriage. Some people talk about it ahead of time, some people don't. And even when you do talk ahead of time about what you expect out of the marriage, sometimes people hold back what's really in their hearts because they're afraid to say. And some people may not even realize what their expectations were until they're in the marriage. Because again, we bring to a marriage what we learned in our parental relationships. And we don't even know it until we're in it, and maybe our spouse recognizes behavior that's reflective of our parents and says it to us. But discussing the expectations of the marriage and being responsible for not explaining or sharing what your expectations were. There's where responsibility lies. And then lastly, number 5, did you properly assess who you were marrying, the ideal versus the reality? Well, a few weeks ago, I did a podcast on the ideal that we live in versus the reality that we live in. Were you truly assessing this person that you were about to marry properly? Are the promises that were made from this other person reasonable to expect? Did you know this person enough? Khloe Kardashian and Lamar Odom, 1 month and she married him. She didn't know him. She didn't know anything about the drugs in his past life and his past friends who were related to the drug industry. She didn't know anything about that. And she married him. It was all based on an overwhelming feeling of love. And that's great. And once in a while, people do get married with a very short-term dating life and it works out, but quite often it doesn't. The ideal versus the reality. It is so hard when we're in love and when we're experiencing all this emotion to be able to separate ideal versus reality. So maybe in taking responsibility for a divorce, maybe you just have to say, I needed more time. I should have spent more time knowing you, the reality of you, because I was living in the ideal of who you were, and maybe in the ideal of what marriage was. And number 3, lastly, now what do you do? Well, now that you're in the marriage and now getting divorced, what do you do in the divorce in terms of taking responsibility? Well, number 1, you don't blame the other spouse to avoid recognizing your own level of responsibility. And I see that all too often at the initial stages of the divorce filing. The blame is still there, especially if the couple didn't go through therapy so that they could take care of all those emotional issues. The mediation is used to blame the other spouse. But when more time goes by, that really does change, because your responsibility is always sitting right on your shoulders. It never goes away. And as soon as you can get in touch with that responsibility, it's so much easier not to blame the other person, because all you can do is be responsible for your own actions. And if there's more blame on the other side, if there's more to apologize from the other spouse, they have to come to their own level of responsibility. You just take care of you. But we all have to stop blaming each other in order to recognize our own level of responsibility. And that's in anything in life. As long as you're blaming, you can't see where your actions may have contributed to the situation that you're in. All right, number 2, don't blame yourself. Just make the necessary decisions to transition out of the marriage. So recognizing your own level of responsibility doesn't mean you have to blame yourself, because blaming yourself, self-flagellation, it just doesn't work. It makes you depressed. It doesn't move you forward. Recognizing responsibility, possibly apologizing for anything that you've done that hurt the other person, that's where it's at. When you can get to the point of apologizing, then you don't have to blame yourself anymore. and you can breathe and you can get the necessary work done to get out of the marriage and move on with a clean slate and a lighter heart. Number 3. Well, I just said apologize. So if an apology is in order, apologize. Some apologies go like this. I should never have agreed to marry. I just wasn't ready. I should never have agreed to marry. I just didn't understand you. I didn't get to know you well enough. And that's me. I should have said I need more time. Here's another apology. I'm so sorry I had an affair. Now that is a really interesting apology. I'm so sorry I had an affair. Those are the hardest words to say. It's so much more frequent to say, well, I had an affair because I wasn't satisfied. I learned this from my mother or father. I needed an outlet. But I never really hear, I am so sorry I had an affair. That puts it on so much more of a personal level. And that really speaks to the other person's heart. I'm so sorry I had an affair. And then you move on from there. Number 3, I'm so sorry I mistreated you. That's something that speaks boatloads. I'm so sorry I mistreated you. It was wrong of me to do that. If I could turn back the hands of time, I would absolutely do that. But I can't. And I just want you to know I am so sorry I mistreated you. Boy, that's really taking responsibility for your actions. Number 4, my intentions were not to hurt you, yet I did. Lovely. My intentions were not to hurt you, yet I did. I mean, these little phrases, they mean so much when honestly spoken, really meant with a heart full of good intention and authenticity. And then lastly, I didn't realize I had work to do on myself until I was actually in the marriage. So yes, I mean, sometimes the first marriage is a practice session, I'm sorry to say, because you just don't know. What if you didn't have a lot of relationships in high school and college? And now you're working and it's a whole different environment. We are older people, supposedly a little more mature. But we didn't have the dating experience to really get to know who we were when engaged in relationships. And so that's really important to say too. If it's true, I honestly didn't realize how much work I had to do on myself until I was actually married. And I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to engage you in this future life that we had talked about together. I just am so sorry I am not the right person to fulfill that dream. I mean, saying things like this can turn everything around for you. Taking responsibility for whatever is your part in the transition out of the marriage will make everything, at least for you, go so much smoothly on a personal level, and hopefully it will move the heart and mind of your spouse so that you can finish the divorce with respect and just a calmer energy. So I hope that helped some of you going through divorce right now. You have been listening to Constructive Uncoupling, a podcast devoted to amicable divorces, and I have been your host, Judy Weigel, your amicable divorce expert. If you would like to reach me with any ideas on future episodes, themes, titles, you can reach me at Judy, Judy, at constructiveuncoupling.com. Judy, Judy, at constructiveuncoupling.com. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll be back next week.